The sound of Mary Catherine O'Brien's sobs carried across the dusty Montana valley like a mournful hymn, cutting through the hot summer air of 1876 and reaching the ears of a man who had spent the last 3 years avoiding all human contact. Her knees pressed into the parched earth between rows of withered plants, dirt streaking her tear-stained cheeks as she surveyed the devastation before her. The garden that had taken months of backbreaking labor to cultivate now lay in ruins, trampled by a herd of wild mustangs that had broken through her failing fence the night before. Tomato plants hung broken and limp, their green fruit crushed into the soil. Corn stalks lay flattened as if a giant hand had swept across them. Bean poles tilted at impossible angles, their vines torn and scattered. The squash she had so carefully tended showed nothing but hoof prints, where bright yellow blossoms had promised an abundant harvest just yesterday. Mary Catherine was 24 years old and had already buried one husband. Thomas O'Brien had been dead 6 months now, taken by fever during the brutal winter, leaving her alone on their small homestead 15 miles outside of Helena, with nothing but debts, memories, and this garden that had represented her only hope of survival through the coming winter. She had sold almost everything of value to buy seeds, had worked from dawn until dusk, breaking the stubborn Montana soil, had carried water bucket by bucket from the creek when the spring rains proved insufficient. And now it was all gone. She did not hear the approach of footsteps, did not sense another presence until a shadow fell across her, and a deep voice, roughened by years of disuse, spoke from somewhere above. "Madam, you hurt?" Mary Catherine's head snapped up, her hand instinctively moving to the rifle she had left leaning against the porch post 20 yards away. The man standing before her was the largest human being she had ever seen. He stood well over 6 feet tall, with shoulders so broad they blocked out the sun. His arms, bare beneath a leather vest, showed muscles that bunched and shifted beneath tanned skin as he held his hands carefully away from his sides in a gesture of peace. Dark hair fell past his shoulders, tied back with a leather cord, and a thick beard covered the lower half of his face. But it was his eyes that held her attention, pale blue and startlingly gentle in that hard, weathered face. "I am not hurt," she managed, her voice hoarse from crying. "Not in body, at least." The man's gaze swept over the destroyed garden, taking in the full extent of the damage with a single comprehensive look. His jaw tightened beneath the beard, and something shifted in those blue eyes. "Mustangs came through," he said. It was not a question. "Last night." Mary Catherine pushed herself to her feet, suddenly aware of how she must look, streaked with dirt and tears, her simple brown dress covered in dust, her auburn hair falling loose from its pins. "I heard them, but by the time I got outside with the rifle, they were already gone. This garden was everything I had. Everything." The man said nothing for a long moment, just stood there looking at the ruined plants, with an expression she could not quite read. Then he turned those pale eyes back to her. "Name is Nathaniel Crane," he said. "Been trapping in the mountains north of here for some years. Came down for supplies." He paused, seemed to be choosing his words carefully. "If you have seed left, I will replant this garden for you." Mary Catherine stared at him, certain she had misheard. "What?" "Replant it. Every seed, every plant that can be saved." His voice was matter-of-fact, as if he were offering to carry a bucket of water rather than proposing days of grueling labor. "We'll take time, but it can be done. Still early enough in the season that most things will make a crop if we get them in the ground quick." "I cannot pay you," Mary Catherine said quickly. "I have almost nothing left after buying the original seeds and did not ask for payment." Nathaniel Crane's eyes held hers steadily. "Just asking if you have seed." "Some," she gestured vaguely toward the small cabin. "I kept back a portion of everything in case of loss, but not enough to replant the whole garden. Not nearly enough. Then we will make do with what you have, and I will get more from town." He set down the pack he had been carrying, and Mary Catherine noticed for the first time the bulk of it, the well-worn leather and careful repairs that spoke of hard use over many years. "You got tools? Hoe, spade, rake?" "Yes, but—" She stopped, overwhelmed by the strangeness of the situation. "Why would you do this? You do not even know me." Nathaniel Crane was quiet for a moment, his gaze drifting to the simple wooden cross visible on the hillside behind the cabin. When he spoke again, his voice was softer, threaded with something that might have been old pain. Lost my own wife 4 years back. Childbirth took her and the baby both, up in the Bitterroot Valley. His hands flexed at his sides. Folks came from 3 farms over to help me through that first season after. Never would have made it without them. Then the memories got too sharp and I took to the mountains. He looked back at her. Figured it is time I paid that kindness forward. Mary Catherine felt fresh tears spring to her eyes, but these were different from the hopeless weeping of an hour ago. I do not know what to say. Say where you keep those tools, and let us get to work before the day gets any hotter. The sun climbed higher as they worked, and Mary Catherine found herself stealing glances at the mountain man who had appeared so unexpectedly in her moment of despair. Nathaniel Crane moved through the ruined garden with surprising efficiency for such a large man, his movements economical and sure. He started by walking the entire plot, examining each plant, sorting the complete losses from those that might be saved with careful attention. "These tomatoes here," he said, kneeling beside a cluster of plants that Mary Catherine had assumed were beyond hope. "Stems are bent but not broken clean through. We stake them proper, they will likely recover. Might lose a week or 2 of growth, but they will produce." He showed her how to splint the damaged stalks with small sticks and strips of cloth, binding them gently but firmly. His hands, so large and rough-looking, worked with unexpected delicacy. As they labored side by side, Mary Catherine felt some of the crushing despair begin to lift. "Have you been trapping all these 4 years?" she asked, partly to break the silence and partly because she found herself genuinely curious about this strange, solitary man. "Mostly. Come down to Helena or Virginia City a few times a year to sell pelts and get supplies. Rest of the time I'm in the high country." He did not look up from his work. "Got a cabin up near the headwaters of the Blackfoot River. Good beaver country, and remote enough that I can go weeks without seeing another soul." "That sounds lonely." Loneliness was the whole point. He moved to the next plant. Easier to be alone in the wilderness than alone in a crowd. Mary Catherine understood that sentiment better than she would have 6 months ago. After Thomas died, well-meaning neighbors had called regularly for the first few weeks, bringing food and sympathy. But as winter dragged on and spring planting began, the visits had tapered off. Everyone had their own struggles, their own homesteads to maintain. She had been alone with her grief and her desperate plans for survival, and the loneliness had been crushing. They worked through the midday heat, pausing only when Nathaniel insisted that Mary Catherine get out of the sun for a spell. She brought out bread and butter and the last of her preserved beef, along with cool water from the well. They ate in the shade of the cabin's small porch, and she found herself studying him more openly now. He was perhaps 30 years old, she guessed, though the beard and the weathering of outdoor life made it difficult to be certain. Despite his size and the hardness that came from years of solitary living, there was nothing threatening in his manner. He ate slowly, methodically, and she noticed that he had given her the larger portion without comment. "This is good bread," he said. "Been a long time since I had anything but cornmeal and hardtack." "Thank you." Mary Catherine hesitated, then asked the question that had been building since they began working. "Will you truly be able to stay long enough to help replant everything? I do not want to keep you from your own work." Nathaniel took a long drink of water before answering. "Pelts are already sold. Supplies can wait. I have got nothing calling me back to the mountains that cannot wait a week or 2. He met her eyes. "And this is important. You are right that you need this garden. Winter comes hard and early up here. You will not make it without a good harvest." The bluntness of his words might have sounded cruel from another man, but from Nathaniel they were simply true. Mary Catherine nodded slowly. "After Thomas died, people said I should give up the homestead and move back east to my family in Ohio. But I have nothing there anymore. My parents are gone. My only sister married a man who made it clear I would not be welcome." She looked out over the valley, the mountains rising purple and magnificent in the distance. "This land was our dream, Thomas's and mine. I thought if I could just hold on to it, make it work, then maybe his death would mean something." "It already means something." Nathaniel's voice was gentle. "He chose a strong woman. That counts for plenty." They returned to work, and as the afternoon wore on, Mary Catherine began to see real progress. The salvageable plants were staked and tended, the completely destroyed sections were cleared, the soil turned and prepared for replanting. Nathaniel worked with a steady intensity that never seemed to flag, even as the heat grew oppressive. Sweat darkened his shirt and made his arms gleam, and Mary Catherine found herself noticing the play of muscle beneath skin, the raw physical power he wielded with such careful control. By evening, perhaps a third of the garden showed signs of recovery or readiness for new seed. It was more progress than Mary Catherine would have thought possible in a single day. As the sun began its descent toward the mountains, Nathaniel straightened from his work and surveyed what they had accomplished. "Good start," he said. "Tomorrow I will ride into Helena and get more seed. You have a list of what you need most?" "I can make one." Mary Catherine wiped her hands on her apron, suddenly aware of her appearance again, of the impropriety of having this man here alone with her. But propriety seemed like a luxury she could no longer afford, and besides, there was nothing in Nathaniel Crane's manner that suggested anything other than genuine desire to help. "Will you stay for supper? It is the least I can offer after all you have done today." Nathaniel hesitated, and she saw something like uncertainty flicker across his face. "Would not want to impose." "You would not be. Please, I would welcome the company." He nodded slowly. "Then yes, thank you. But let me see to my horse first." Left him tethered down by the creek. While Nathaniel went to tend to his mount, Mary Catherine hurried inside to make herself more presentable and to prepare a meal. She had little enough to work with, but she managed a decent stew from dried vegetables and salt pork, along with more bread and some wild berry preserves she had put up the previous summer. As she worked, she caught herself humming, something she had not done since before Thomas's death. When Nathaniel returned, leading a sturdy bay gelding to the small corral beside the cabin, Mary Catherine had the table set and the stew bubbling over the fire. He washed at the pump outside, and when he came in, she noticed that he had tied his hair back more neatly and had made some effort to brush the worst of the dust from his clothes. The cabin was small, just one main room with a sleeping alcove, but Mary Catherine had done her best to make it homely. Curtains she had sewn herself hung at the windows, and a braided rag rug covered the center of the plank floor. Nathaniel seemed too large for the space, his broad shoulders and height making everything appear smaller, but he moved carefully, aware of his size. They ate, and the silence between them was comfortable rather than awkward. After the meal, Nathaniel helped her clear the dishes without being asked, another small kindness that touched her more than it probably should have. When the work was done, they sat on the porch as twilight settled over the valley, and Mary Catherine found herself telling him about Thomas, about their journey west, about the dreams they had shared. "We met in Ohio," she said, watching the first stars appear in the darkening sky. "He was working for my father's mercantile, learning the business. But Thomas did not want to be a shopkeeper. He wanted land of his own, space to breathe, freedom. When he asked me to marry him, he was honest about his plans to go west, gave me the choice to say no. But you said yes?" "I did. I was 19 and thought it all sounded terribly romantic." She smiled sadly. "The reality was harder than I imagined. The journey out was grueling. We lost 2 wagons in our train to cholera, and I was sick for weeks in Nebraska. But when we finally reached Montana and filed our claim, I thought it was all worth it. Thomas was so happy here. He loved this land." "How long were you married?" 3 years. Not nearly enough time." Mary Catherine wrapped her arms around herself, though the evening was still warm. "The fever came on so suddenly. One day he was fine, working on reinforcing the barn. 2 days later he was burning up and delirious. 3 days after that he was gone. I tried everything I knew, but nothing helped." Nathaniel was quiet for a long moment. When he spoke, his voice carried the weight of shared grief. "My Elizabeth went the same way, quick and without warning. One moment I was holding our son, healthy and squalling, the next the bleeding would not stop. His hands gripped the edge of the porch. She made me promise to take care of him, to raise him strong, but he only lived a few hours after she passed, never even named him proper." Mary Catherine reached out without thinking, placing her hand over his. His skin was warm, calloused, the hand of a man who lived by his labor. He did not pull away, just sat very still, looking down at where her smaller hand rested on his. "I'm so sorry," she said softly. "It is part of life out here. Death is always close. We all know it. He turned his hand over, gently clasping hers. But knowing does not make it easier to bear. They sat like that as full darkness fell, two people bound by loss and loneliness, finding unexpected comfort in shared silence. When Mary Catherine finally withdrew her hand and suggested they should rest for tomorrow's work, Nathaniel nodded and rose to his feet. "I will sleep out here on the porch, if that suits you," he said. "Got my bedroll on my horse." "That is fine. Thank you, Nathaniel, for everything." He looked down at her, and in the lamplight spilling from the cabin, his eyes were very blue. "Mary Catherine," he said, as if testing the sound of her name, "sleep well. We have got hard work ahead." She went inside and closed the door, then stood with her back against it, her heart beating faster than the simple conversation warranted. She heard him moving around outside, the soft sounds of him preparing his sleeping area, the low murmur of his voice as he spoke to his horse. When silence finally fell, she changed into her nightdress and lay down in the narrow bed she had shared with Thomas. But sleep was slow to come. For the first time in 6 months, she found herself thinking about something other than mere survival. She found herself thinking about pale blue eyes and gentle hands, about a man who had appeared like an answer to a prayer she had not known how to pray. And the thought frightened her even as it brought a flutter of something dangerously close to hope. Morning came with the rooster's crow from the hen house, and Mary Catherine woke to find Nathaniel already up and working in the garden. She dressed quickly and went out to find that he had repaired a large section of the fence in the pre-dawn hours, using saplings he must have cut from the nearby woods. "You should have woken me," she said, bringing him coffee and leftover cornbread. "You do not have to do all this alone." "Let you sleep. You looked tired." He accepted the coffee gratefully. "Besides, fence work goes faster with one person. Too much stopping to coordinate." They ate breakfast together as the sun rose, painting the mountain peaks gold and rose. Nathaniel had his list ready, items written in a surprisingly neat hand on paper Mary Catherine had provided the night before. "I will ride out now, get to Helena by mid-morning, should be back by late afternoon with everything we need." He drained his coffee cup and stood. "While I am gone, you might want to work on clearing the rest of the damaged plants from the eastern section. But do not overdo it. Plenty of time yet." Mary Catherine watched him saddle his horse, noting again the quiet competence of his movements, the way the animal stood calm and trusting under his hands. As he prepared to mount, she found herself reluctant to see him go, even for a few hours. "Nathaniel," she called out, and he turned back. "Be careful." Something flickered in his expression, a softness that transformed his hard features. "I will. You do the same." He rode out across the valley, and Mary Catherine stood watching until he disappeared from sight. Then she turned back to the garden and threw herself into work, trying not to think too hard about why her heart felt lighter than it had in months. The day proved long and hot. Mary Catherine worked steadily, following Nathaniel's assessment of which plants to keep and which to remove. The physical labor was demanding, but she welcomed it. Hard work kept her mind occupied, kept her from dwelling on the strange turn her life had taken in just 24 hours. By noon, she was exhausted and retreated to the cabin for food and rest. As she ate, she found her eyes drifting to the porch where Nathaniel had slept, to the neatly rolled bedding he had stowed in the corner. The intimacy of having him here, of sharing her space with a man who was not her husband, should have felt wrong. Instead, it felt strangely right, as if some part of her had been waiting for exactly this. She was back in the garden when she heard the sound of hoofbeats. Her heart lifted as she looked up, expecting to see Nathaniel returning. But the rider approaching was not the mountain man. Sheriff Coleman Davies rode a dappled gray mare, and his expression was stern as he dismounted near the cabin. "Mrs. O'Brien," he said, touching his hat brim. "Mind if we have a word?" Mary Catherine set down her hoe, unease prickling along her spine. Sheriff Davies was a fair man, but unbending when it came to the law. "Of course, Sheriff. Is something wrong?" "That's what I came to ask you." He glanced around the homestead, taking in the repaired fence and the evidence of recent work. "Got a report from Mrs. Henderson that you had a strange man staying here. Large fellow, mountain type. She was concerned for your welfare." Of course. Martha Henderson lived on the nearest neighboring farm, 2 miles to the south. The woman meant well, but she had strong opinions about proper behavior, and a widow living alone with a man would certainly have raised her alarm. "His name is Nathaniel Crane," Mary Catherine said evenly. "He is a trapper who stopped to help when he saw my garden had been destroyed. He has been nothing but respectful and kind." "That may be, but you must see how it looks." Sheriff Davis's tone was not unkind, but firm. "You are a widow, still in mourning. Having a man staying here, sleeping on your property, it is not proper. Folks will talk." "Let them talk." The words came out sharper than Mary Catherine intended, fueled by sudden anger. "That garden is my only hope of surviving the winter. Mr. Crane offered help when I desperately needed it. I will not turn him away because of gossip." The sheriff sighed. "I understand your situation, Mrs. O'Brien. Truly I do. But I have to think of your reputation. Once that is damaged, it is near impossible to repair. And without a good name, you will find life out here even harder than it already is. My reputation will not feed me when winter comes, and my stores are empty." Mary Catherine met his eyes steadily. "I appreciate your concern, Sheriff, but Mr. Crane will stay until the work is finished. After that, he will return to his cabin in the mountains, and life will go on as before." Sheriff Davies studied her for a long moment, then nodded slowly. "All right. I can see your mind is made up. But I will ride by again in a few days, just to make certain everything remains proper. And Mrs. O'Brien, if you do need help, real help, you send word. There are resources available for widows in difficult circumstances." "Thank you, Sheriff. I will keep that in mind." He rode away, and Mary Catherine returned to her work with hands that shook slightly. She had never defied authority so directly before, had never put her own needs so plainly above social convention. But the thought of sending Nathaniel away, of facing the ruined garden alone again, was unbearable. When Nathaniel returned in late afternoon, his saddlebags bulging with supplies, Mary Catherine told him about the sheriff's visit. She watched his face carefully as she spoke, trying to gauge his reaction. "I should go," he said quietly when she finished. "Last thing I want is to cause you trouble." "No," the word came out more forcefully than she intended. "You promised to help me replant this garden, and I am holding you to that promise. I do not care what the neighbors think." Nathaniel looked at her for a long moment, something shifting in those pale blue eyes. "You are certain?" "I am certain." He nodded slowly, then began unloading the seeds he had purchased. There were packets of everything she had lost and more besides, varieties she had not been able to afford the first time. When she protested the expense, Nathaniel waved her off. "Call it an investment," he said. "You get a good harvest, you can pay me back in vegetables come fall." They worked until dusk, planting seeds in the sections Nathaniel had prepared, spacing them according to his careful calculations. He knew far more about farming than Mary Catherine would have expected from a mountain man, and when she commented on it, he smiled slightly. "Grew up on a farm in Missouri," he explained. "Worked the land until I was 18, then got restless and headed west. But some knowledge stays with you, no matter how far you roam." As they worked side by side, their hands occasionally brushing as they reached for the same tool or packet of seeds, Mary Catherine felt something growing between them that had nothing to do with gardens or survival. It was in the way Nathaniel's voice softened when he spoke to her, the way his eyes followed her movements when he thought she was not looking, the way her own pulse quickened whenever he came near. That evening, after another simple meal shared in companionable silence, they sat on the porch and watched the stars emerge. The night air was cool and sweet, carrying the scent of turned earth and possibility. "Tell me about your life in the mountains," Mary Catherine said. "What is it like, living alone for months at a time?" Nathaniel leaned back against the cabin wall, his long legs stretched out before him. Quiet, peaceful, the kind of peace you cannot find anywhere else. He paused, choosing his words carefully. "When Elizabeth died, I could not bear to be around people. Everyone wanted to help, to comfort me, but their words felt empty. The mountains did not try to make things better. They just existed, hard and beautiful and indifferent. That felt honest. And now? Is it still what you need?" He was quiet for a long time, so long that Mary Catherine thought he might not answer. When he finally spoke, his voice was low and thoughtful. "I thought it was. But being here these past days, working beside you, Having someone to talk to at the end of the day, it has reminded me of what I gave up when I chose solitude." He turned to look at her. "I am not certain anymore that running away was the answer. Maybe it was just the easiest path." Mary Catherine's breath caught in her throat. In the starlight, Nathaniel's face was all plains and shadows, beautiful in its ruggedness. She wanted to reach out to him, to touch him, to close the distance between them, but she did not quite dare. "I am glad you came down from those mountains," she said softly. "I do not know what I would have done without your help. You would have managed. You are stronger than you think." "Maybe, but I am grateful I did not have to find out." They sat in silence for a while longer, and when Mary Catherine finally rose to go inside, Nathaniel stood as well. They faced each other in the darkness, so close that she could feel the warmth radiating from his body, could hear the steady rhythm of his breathing. "Good night, Mary Catherine," he said, and his voice was rough with something that might have been longing. "Good night, Nathaniel." She went inside but did not immediately prepare for bed. Instead, she stood at the window, watching his silhouette as he settled onto the porch, watching until he lay down and grew still. Her heart was pounding, her skin felt too tight for her body, and she recognized these feelings for what they were. She was falling in love with the mountain man who had appeared in her darkest hour, and the realization was both thrilling and terrifying. The next days fell into a rhythm. They rose with the sun and worked through the morning hours, pausing during the worst heat of midday, before resuming in the late afternoon and evening. Slowly, steadily, the garden came back to life. New shoots appeared in the replanted sections, bright green and full of promise. The salvaged plants, carefully tended, began to thrive again. As the garden grew, so did the connection between Mary Catherine and Nathaniel. They talked as they worked, sharing stories of their pasts, their hopes, their fears. Mary Catherine learned that Nathaniel had been the oldest of 6 children, that he had helped raise his younger siblings after their mother died of consumption. She learned that he loved books but rarely had access to them in the mountains, that he could track a deer through country that would baffle most men, that he had once spent an entire winter snowed into his cabin with nothing but his thoughts for company. Nathaniel learned that Mary Catherine had wanted to be a teacher before she married Thomas, that she could recite long passages of poetry from memory, that she was terrified of thunderstorms but would never admit it to anyone else. He learned that she had a talent for healing, that neighbors used to come to her for remedies when their own doctoring failed, that she missed having other women to talk to, but was too proud to admit her loneliness. On the 5th day of replanting, a summer storm rolled in from the west, dark clouds piling up against the mountain peaks. Nathaniel looked at the sky with an experienced eye and shook his head. "Going to be a bad one," he said. "We should get everything secured. Animals in the barn, tools put away, anything loose tied down." They worked quickly, and Nathaniel's efficiency was a blessing. By the time the first fat raindrops began to fall, everything was ready. They stood on the porch and watched the storm approach, a solid wall of gray sweeping across the valley. "You should come inside," Mary Catherine said as thunder rumbled in the distance. "You will be soaked out here." Nathaniel hesitated, clearly uncomfortable with the idea of crossing that threshold. "I will be fine. Got my slicker." "Please," she touched his arm lightly. "I do not want you to catch your death out here." The storm hit with sudden violence, rain sheeting down so hard it was impossible to see more than a few feet. Wind howled around the cabin, and lightning split the sky with blue-white brilliance. Nathaniel finally conceded and followed Mary Catherine inside, water already streaming from his hair and clothes. She brought him towels and he dried off as best he could, then stood awkwardly in the center of the small room, clearly uncertain what to do with himself. Mary Catherine lit the lamps against the premature darkness and set water to heat for coffee. "You can sit," she said, gesturing to the table. "I will not bite." He smiled at that, a rare, full smile that transformed his entire face, and Mary Catherine felt her heart turn over in her chest. He sat, and she poured coffee for them both, then settled across from him. The storm raged outside, but inside the cabin felt warm and safe, almost cozy. "I used to love storms like this," Mary Catherine said, wrapping her hands around her cup. "When I was a girl in Ohio, I would sit by the window and watch them come in. My mother thought I was foolish, but there was something about the power of it, the wildness, that thrilled me." "You said you were afraid of thunderstorms." She looked up, surprised that he remembered. "I am now. The night Thomas died, there was a storm like this. I kept thinking the thunder was him trying to come back, trying to tell me something. I know it is ridiculous, but I cannot shake the feeling. As if in response to her words, a tremendous crack of thunder shook the cabin. Mary Catherine flinched involuntarily, and Nathaniel was around the table in an instant, crouching beside her chair. "It is all right," he said softly. "Just noise. Cannot hurt you." Mary Catherine was trembling, caught in the grip of memory and fear. Without thinking, she turned into him, and his arms came around her strong and sure. He held her as the storm raged, one large hand smoothing over her hair, his deep voice murmuring reassurances. Gradually, the fear faded, replaced by awareness of the man holding her. She could feel the solid warmth of his chest, the steady beat of his heart, the strength in the arms wrapped around her. When she tilted her head back to look at him, his face was very close, his eyes dark with something that had nothing to do with the storm. "Mary Catherine," he said, and her name was a question, a plea, a prayer. She did not know who moved first, only that suddenly his mouth was on hers, and she was kissing him back with a desperation that surprised them both. His lips were firm and warm, tasting of coffee and rain, and when his hand came up to cup the back of her head, threading through her hair, she made a small sound of need that seemed to shake him. He pulled back, breathing hard, his eyes searching her face. "I should not have done that. I'm sorry." "Do not be sorry." Mary Catherine's hands were fisted in his shirt, holding him in place. "Do not you dare be sorry. You are vulnerable right now, grieving. I do not want to take advantage. You are not taking anything I am not offering freely." She met his eyes steadily, letting him see the truth of her words. "I want this, Nathaniel. I want you." He made a sound low in his throat and kissed her again, deeper this time, with a barely leashed hunger that made her blood sing. His hands were careful despite the passion in his kiss, holding her as if she were something precious that might break. When they finally broke apart, both breathing raggedly, the storm outside had diminished to steady rain. "I should go back out to the porch," Nathaniel said, though he made no move to release her. "Stay." The word hung between them, weighted with implication. "Just to wait out the storm. We do not have to. I am not suggesting that we—" She stopped, flustered, feeling heat rise in her cheeks. Nathaniel smiled, that rare, beautiful smile, and gently tucked a strand of hair behind her ear. "I know what you mean. And yes, I will stay until the storm passes." They moved to sit on the narrow bench near the fireplace, and Nathaniel put his arm around her shoulders. Mary Catherine leaned into his warmth, fitting against his side as if she had been made for exactly that purpose. They talked quietly as the rain drummed on the roof, about nothing and everything, and Mary Catherine could not remember the last time she had felt so content. When the storm finally cleared and Nathaniel reluctantly returned to his bedroll on the porch, Mary Catherine lay in her bed and pressed her fingers to her lips, still feeling the ghost of his kiss. She knew she should feel guilty. That Thomas had been dead less than a year, and here she was falling for another man. But guilt would not come. Instead, there was only a growing certainty that Nathaniel Crane had come into her life for a reason, and that perhaps grief did not have to last forever. The next morning brought awkwardness neither of them seemed to know how to navigate. They were overly polite at breakfast, careful not to touch, their conversation stilted. But as they returned to work in the garden, the familiar rhythm of shared labor eased the tension. By midday, things felt almost normal again, though the air between them seemed charged with new possibility. "The garden looks good," Nathaniel said, surveying their work with satisfaction. "Another few days and everything will be planted. After that, it is just a matter of maintenance, watering, weeding, keeping the pests away." Mary Catherine felt her heart sink at the implication. "And then you will leave." He was quiet for a moment, his hands still on the hoe he had been using. "That was the plan. But it does not have to be." The words came out in a rush before she could stop them. "You could stay longer. There's always work to be done on a homestead, and I could use the help. And Mary Catherine," he set down the hoe and turned to face her fully. "What are we doing here?" "I do not know what you mean." "Yes, you do." His eyes held hers, intense and searching. "What happened last night? That kiss, the way I feel when I am near you, The way you look at me. We both know this is becoming something more than a mountain man helping a widow with her garden." Mary Catherine's throat was tight. Would that be so terrible? It might be, if we are not honest about what we want. He took a step closer. I have been alone for 4 years because I was afraid to feel anything again, afraid that caring for someone would just mean more pain when I inevitably lost them. But these days with you, Mary Catherine, they have reminded me that being alive means taking risks, feeling things, even when it is terrifying. I am terrified too, she admitted. Thomas has been gone such a short time. People will say I am dishonoring his memory if I move on so quickly. And maybe they are right. Maybe I should wait, should mourn longer before even thinking about another man. Or maybe life is too short and too hard out here to waste time on should and maybe. Nathaniel reached out and took her hand, his thumb tracing gentle circles on her palm. I am not asking you to make any decisions right now. I'm just asking you to be honest with yourself about what you feel. I feel like I am waking up after a long sleep, Mary Catherine said softly. Like I have been moving through the world in a daze since Thomas died, just going through the motions of survival. But when you are near me, I feel alive again. I feel hope. And yes, it terrifies me, because I know how quickly hope can be taken away. Nathaniel raised her hand to his lips and pressed a gentle kiss to her knuckles. Then we will be terrified together. The remaining days of planting passed in a haze of growing connection. They continued to work side by side, but now there were casual touches, hands lingering when they passed tools back and forth, shoulders brushing as they knelt in adjacent rows. In the evenings, they sat closer together on the porch, and sometimes Nathaniel would take her hand in his, just holding it, as they watched the sun set behind the mountains. On the 8th day since Nathaniel's arrival, they planted the last of the seeds. The garden that had been a wasteland of destruction now showed neat, orderly rows of green shoots and carefully tended plants. It was a minor miracle, testament to hard work and determination and the kindness of a stranger who was no longer a stranger at all. It is beautiful, Mary Catherine said, standing back to survey their accomplishment. I cannot believe we actually did it. You did it, Nathaniel corrected. I just helped. You did far more than help. You saved me, Nathaniel, in more ways than one. He looked at her, and the expression in his eyes made her breath catch. Maybe we saved each other. That night, after supper, Nathaniel brought something out of his saddlebag, a small wrapped bundle that he handed to Mary Catherine with an almost shy expression. "Got this for you in Helena," he said. "Saw it in the mercantile window and thought you might like it." Mary Catherine unwrapped the bundle to find a book, a collection of poetry by Walt Whitman. It was not new, the cover was worn, and the pages showed signs of previous reading, but it was still a luxury, still a treasure. She looked up at Nathaniel with tears in her eyes. "You remembered that I loved poetry. Remembered everything you told me." He shifted his weight, suddenly uncertain. "If you already have it, or if it is not to your taste, I can—" Mary Catherine stopped his words with a kiss, rising on her toes to reach him, pouring gratitude and affection and growing love into the press of her lips against his. Nathaniel responded with gentle hunger, his arms coming around her to lift her almost off her feet. When they broke apart, both breathing hard, he rested his forehead against hers. "I do not want to leave tomorrow," he said quietly. "Then do not leave. Stay, Nathaniel, stay with me." "For how long?" Mary Catherine pulled back enough to look into his eyes. "For as long as you want, for as long as you can stand my company, forever if you are brave enough." A slow smile spread across Nathaniel's face, lighting him from within. "Forever is a long time." "I know, but I think we might have found something worth holding on to." He kissed her again, deep and sweet and full of promise. When they finally drew apart, the moon had risen over the mountains, bathing the valley in silver light. "I will have to go back to my cabin eventually," Nathaniel said. "Gather my things, settle my affairs there. But then, if you will have me, I would like to come back, make a life here with you if you are willing." "I am willing." Mary Catherine felt joy bubble up inside her, bright and irrepressible. "But what will people say? The sheriff already warned me about my reputation." "Let them say what they will. We will do this proper if that makes it easier." Court for a while. Get married when enough time has passed that folks will not think poorly of you. He cupped her face in his hands. I want to do right by you, Mary Catherine. You deserve that. She leaned into his touch, feeling safer and happier than she had in longer than she could remember. How long will you be gone? A week, maybe 2. Need to pack up my cabin, sell off what I cannot bring, arrange to trade my trapping territory to another man. He kissed her forehead. But I will come back. I promise you that. They spent that night talking on the porch until the stars wheeled overhead and exhaustion finally claimed them both. When Mary Catherine went inside, she held the poetry book to her chest and thought about the strange turns life could take, about how devastation could lead to unexpected blessings, about how love could bloom even in the hardest soil. Nathaniel left at dawn, riding out across the valley as Mary Catherine watched from the porch. He turned back 3 times to look at her, and each time she waved, her heart aching with missing him, even as joy sang through her veins. He would come back. He had promised, and she believed him. The days after Nathaniel's departure were long and quiet. Mary Catherine threw herself into maintaining the garden, following the careful instructions he had left her for watering and weeding and pest control. The plants thrived under her attention, growing visibly from day to day, and every new shoot and blossom felt like a small victory. Sheriff Davies rode by twice more, ostensibly to check on her welfare, but really to see if the mountain man had left. When he found Mary Catherine alone, he seemed satisfied and did not press further. Martha Henderson also visited, bringing fresh eggs and poorly concealed curiosity. I hear your gentleman friend has moved on, Martha said, her eyes shrewd. Mr. Crane returned to his cabin in the mountains, Mary Catherine replied evenly, but he will be back. Oh, and what makes you so certain? Because he gave me his word. Mary Catherine met the older woman's gaze without flinching. And I trust him. Martha pursed her lips disapprovingly, but did not argue further. After she left, Mary Catherine allowed herself a small smile. Let the neighbors talk. She knew her own heart, and more importantly, she knew Nathaniel's. 12 days after Nathaniel's departure, Mary Catherine was working in the garden when she heard the sound of approaching hoofbeats. She looked up, shading her eyes against the afternoon sun, and her heart leaped as she recognized the rider. Nathaniel was coming home. He rode into the yard leading a pack mule laden with supplies, and Mary Catherine ran to meet him, propriety forgotten. He dismounted and caught her in his arms, lifting her off her feet and spinning her around as she laughed with pure joy. You came back, she said unnecessarily, her hands framing his face. Said I would. He set her down but did not release her, his eyes devouring her face as if memorizing every detail. Missed you every moment I was gone. I missed you too. The garden has been growing beautifully. Wait until you see. They walked hand in hand to survey the plants, and Nathaniel made approving sounds at the evidence of her careful tending. Everything was thriving, the tomatoes already showing small green fruit, the cornstalks rising tall and strong, the bean vines climbing their poles with determined vigor. You did well, he said, pride evident in his voice. This is going to be a fine harvest. Over the next weeks, Nathaniel settled into life on the homestead. He was careful to maintain propriety. Sleeping in the small barn he quickly repaired and expanded, taking his meals with Mary Catherine, but making sure to do nothing that would give the neighbors cause for real scandal. But anyone who saw them together could see the love growing between them, evident in every shared glance and gentle touch. Nathaniel threw himself into improving the homestead with the same intensity he had brought to replanting the garden. He reinforced the cabin's foundation, replaced the poorly fitted door, built proper shutters for the windows. He expanded the corral and repaired the chicken coop, hunted to supplement their diet, and worked alongside Mary Catherine in the garden every day. As summer deepened, they fell into an easy rhythm of work and companionship. In the evenings, they would sit together and Mary Catherine would read aloud from the poetry book Nathaniel had given her, or they would simply talk, learning the smallest details of each other's lives. Nathaniel proved to be a thoughtful listener and a surprisingly good storyteller, regaling her with tales of his years in the mountains, of close calls with bears and mountain lions, of the harsh beauty of winter in the high country. Do you miss it? Mary Catherine asked one evening as they sat watching fireflies dance in the gathering dusk. The mountains? The solitude? Nathaniel was quiet for a moment, his hand warm around hers. Sometimes I miss the simplicity of it. Up there, everything is straightforward. Hunt to eat, gather wood to stay warm, survive until spring, no complications, no worries about what other people think or say. He brought her hand to his lips and kissed her palm. But I would not trade what I have here for all the solitude in the world. I was existing up there, Mary Catherine. Here with you, I am living. As fall approached, their relationship deepened. They talked about the future, making plans for expanding the homestead, for the animals they would raise and the crops they would plant. Nathaniel spoke of building a larger cabin, one with a proper bedroom, and perhaps space for a child or two if they were blessed. Each conversation wove them more tightly together, building a foundation for a shared life. It was mid-August when Nathaniel asked her to marry him. They were in the garden, harvesting the first ripe tomatoes, when he suddenly stopped and turned to her, a seriousness in his expression that made her heart skip. Mary Catherine, I know we agreed to wait, to let enough time pass that folks would not judge you harshly, but I cannot wait any longer to make you my wife. He dropped to one knee right there among the tomato plants, heedless of the dirt. I do not have much to offer you except my strength and my devotion, but those I give freely and completely. Will you marry me? Mary Catherine felt tears spring to her eyes, happy tears this time. Yes. Yes, Nathaniel, I will marry you. He stood and pulled her into his arms, kissing her with a passion that had been restrained by propriety and circumstance for too long. When they broke apart, both breathing hard, his eyes were blazing with love and desire. I want to do this proper, he said. Announce our engagement, give folks time to get used to the idea, have a real wedding with witnesses and vows before God. I do not care about a big wedding. I just want to be your wife. You will be soon enough. He kissed her forehead. But you deserve better than a hurried ceremony that makes people whisper. We will do this right, Mary Catherine. We will do it in a way that honors both you and the memory of Thomas. He was a good man who loved you. I will not dishonor that by rushing you into something before you are ready. Mary Catherine loved him even more for that consideration, for his respect for her past, even as he built toward their future. They agreed to wait until October, giving 8 months of widowhood behind her. It was still faster than convention dictated, but it was long enough to be respectable. The announcement of their engagement caused exactly the stir Nathaniel had predicted. Some neighbors were genuinely happy for them, understanding that life was hard enough without forcing a young woman to spend years alone. Others, like Martha Henderson, pursed their lips and muttered about unseemly haste and respect for the dead. But Mary Catherine found that she did not care as much as she had feared. With Nathaniel beside her, solid and supportive, she could weather any amount of gossip. The harvest came in abundance, far exceeding their most optimistic projections. The garden that had been destroyed and reborn produced vegetables in such quantity that Mary Catherine was able to sell the surplus in Helena, earning enough money to pay back the debts Thomas had left and to purchase supplies for winter. Every bushel of tomatoes, every sack of beans, every basket of squash felt like a victory, a tangible reminder of how far they had come since that terrible morning when she had wept over ruined crops. As the wedding day approached, Mary Catherine found herself thinking often of Thomas. She would always love him, would always treasure the years they had shared. But she had learned that the human heart was capable of holding more than one love, that grief and joy could coexist, that moving forward did not mean forgetting the past. The night before the wedding, Nathaniel stayed in town at the hotel, observing the tradition of not seeing the bride. Mary Catherine spent the evening alone in the cabin, preparing for the next day and thinking about all that had changed. A year ago, she had been a new widow, facing a Montana winter with nothing but a failing homestead and fading hope. Now she stood on the threshold of a new marriage, a new life, with a man who made her feel cherished and safe and wildly, wonderfully alive. The wedding took place on a crisp October morning in the small church in Helena. The ceremony was simple but heartfelt, attended by a scattering of neighbors and townspeople. Mary Catherine wore a dress she had sewn herself from fabric Nathaniel had bought her, a deep green that brought out the auburn in her hair. Nathaniel wore new clothes as well, clean trousers and a white shirt that emphasized the breadth of his shoulders, his long hair neatly tied back, his beard trimmed. As they stood before the preacher and exchanged vows, Mary Catherine looked into Nathaniel's pale blue eyes and saw her future reflected there. When the preacher pronounced them husband and wife, and Nathaniel kissed her, sweet and sure, she felt a rightness settle into her bones. This was where she belonged. This was what she had been moving toward all along. The celebration afterward was modest, held in the church hall with food provided by various neighbors. But Mary Catherine barely noticed the details. She was too aware of Nathaniel beside her, of the way his hand stayed at the small of her back, of the pride and love evident in his face every time he looked at her. As evening fell, they rode back to the homestead together, Nathaniel's arm around her waist as they shared his horse. The cabin had never looked so welcoming as it did that night, lamplight glowing warm in the windows. Nathaniel lifted her down from the horse, and then, in a move that made her laugh with surprise and delight, he swept her into his arms and carried her across the threshold. "Welcome home, Mrs. Crane," he said, setting her carefully on her feet. "I was already home," Mary Catherine replied, reaching up to cup his face. "You became my home the day you stopped to help a heartbroken widow with her ruined garden." That night they came together as husband and wife, and it was everything Mary Catherine had hoped for and more. Nathaniel was gentle and passionate in equal measure, taking time to learn what pleased her, to show her without words how precious she was to him. When they finally lay tangled together in the darkness, sated and happy, Mary Catherine felt a completeness she had never known before. "I love you," she whispered against his chest. "I love you too," Nathaniel replied, his arms tightening around her. "More than I thought I could ever love anyone again." Winter came early that year, snow falling in November and building into deep drifts by December. But the cabin was warm and well stocked with the harvest from the garden they had planted together. Mary Catherine and Nathaniel spent the long winter nights talking and reading and planning for the spring. They spoke of the crops they would plant, of the cattle they hoped to purchase come summer, of the additions they would make to the homestead. As the snow piled high and the temperatures dropped, they discovered the joy of being snowed in together. Unlike the isolation Nathaniel had endured in his mountain cabin, this was a companionable confinement. They cooked together, worked on small projects to improve the cabin, played card games by lamplight, and made love with increasing confidence and pleasure as they learned each other's bodies and desires. One particularly fierce storm kept them inside for 3 days straight. On the second night, as wind howled around the cabin and snow scratched against the windows, Mary Catherine woke to find Nathaniel sitting up in bed, his face troubled. "What is wrong?" she asked, touching his arm. "Just thinking about how different this is from my other winters alone." He turned to look at her, and even in the darkness she could see the emotion in his eyes. "Those years after Elizabeth died, I convinced myself that I was better off without anyone, that needing people was weakness. But lying here with you, listening to the storm, all I can think is how grateful I am not to be alone. How grateful I am that mustangs destroyed your garden and gave me a reason to stop running from life." Mary Catherine sat up and wrapped her arms around him, resting her head against his shoulder. "I am grateful too, for the garden, for you, for this second chance at happiness. Sometimes I think Thomas would be glad, knowing that I found someone to love again, someone who takes care of me the way you do." "He would be glad," Nathaniel said with certainty. "Any man who truly loved you would want you to be happy, even if it meant finding that happiness with someone else." As winter slowly gave way to spring, Mary Catherine began to suspect that she might be pregnant. She said nothing at first, not wanting to raise Nathaniel's hopes until she was certain, but as the signs became unmistakable, she finally told him one evening in early March. Nathaniel's reaction was everything she could have hoped for. His face transformed with joy and then immediately shifted to concern. "Are you well? Do you need to see a doctor? Should you be resting more?" The questions tumbled out, and Mary Catherine laughed even as tears sprang to her eyes. "I am well, healthy and strong. Women have been having babies for thousands of years, Nathaniel." "I know, but—" He stopped, and she saw fear flicker in his eyes. The memory of Elizabeth, of his loss, still haunted him. "I am not Elizabeth," Mary Catherine said gently, taking his hands in hers. "And you are not the same man you were then. We will face this together, and everything will be all right." Nathaniel pulled her close, holding her as if she were infinitely precious. "I could not bear to lose you. You will not lose me. I promise." As spring arrived and the snow melted, revealing the brown earth beneath, they began preparing for both a new growing season and a new baby. Nathaniel became almost comically protective, insisting that Mary Catherine rest while he did most of the heavy work of planting. She humored him when she could, and ignored him when she could not, knowing that his protectiveness came from love and fear in equal measure. The garden they planted that second spring was twice the size of the first, expanding into new sections that Nathaniel had prepared over the winter. They planted all the crops from the previous year, plus new varieties, dreaming of abundance. As the seeds sprouted and the plants grew, Mary Catherine's belly swelled as well, tangible evidence of the life they had created together. Summer brought challenges, the heat was oppressive, and Mary Catherine tired more easily than she would admit. But Nathaniel was endlessly patient, bringing her water, making her sit in the shade, taking over any task that seemed too strenuous. The garden flourished under his care, and neighbors who stopped by to check on the expectant mother invariably commented on the remarkable transformation of the homestead. "Hard to believe this is the same place," Sheriff Davies said during one of his visits. "You two have done wonders here." "Nathaniel has done wonders," Mary Catherine corrected, watching her husband work in the distance. "I just try to keep up." "I will admit I had my doubts about him at first," the sheriff said, "but I can see now that I was wrong. He is a good man, Mrs. Crane. You chose well." As her pregnancy advanced, Mary Catherine found herself thinking often about the journey that had brought her to this moment. If the mustangs had not destroyed her garden, if Nathaniel had not come down from the mountains at exactly that moment, if she had sent him away out of concern for propriety, her life would be so different now. It seemed impossible that such devastation could have led to such joy, but life had a way of surprising you. In late September, as the garden reached the peak of harvest and the leaves began to turn gold in the mountains, Mary Catherine went into labor. Nathaniel had arranged for a midwife from Helena to be present, and the older woman arrived just as the contractions began in earnest. The labor was long and difficult, lasting through the night and into the next day. Nathaniel paced outside the cabin, unable to bear being away from Mary Catherine, but too afraid to witness her pain. He had never felt so helpless, so powerless, and the memories of losing Elizabeth threatened to overwhelm him. But as afternoon light slanted through the cabin windows, a new sound joined the low moans of labor. The sharp, indignant cry of a newborn baby filled the air, and Nathaniel's heart nearly stopped. He stood frozen, afraid to hope, until the midwife opened the door with a wide smile. "You have a son, Mr. Crane. Big, healthy boy with a good set of lungs, and your wife is tired, but doing just fine." Nathaniel stumbled into the cabin to find Mary Catherine propped up in bed, exhausted but radiant, holding a tiny bundle wrapped in soft cloth. When she looked up and saw him, her face lit with a smile that took his breath away. "Come meet your son," she said softly. Nathaniel approached slowly, almost reverently, and looked down at the tiny red face peeking from the blanket. The baby was perfect, small but clearly robust, with a shock of dark hair and eyes that would probably turn blue like his father's. Emotion crashed over Nathaniel in a wave so powerful it nearly brought him to his knees. "He is beautiful," he managed, his voice rough with tears. "You're both so beautiful." Mary Catherine reached out and took his hand, guiding it to rest gently on the baby's small body. "We will name him Thomas Nathaniel, if that suits you, to honor both the man I lost and the man I found." Nathaniel looked at her with eyes full of love and gratitude. "It suits me perfectly." The weeks after the baby's birth were a blur of sleepless nights and overwhelming love. Nathaniel proved to be a devoted father, pacing the cabin floor at all hours to soothe his crying son, changing nappies without complaint, and watching over Mary Catherine with tender concern as she recovered her strength. The fear that had gripped him during the pregnancy gradually eased as both mother and child continued to thrive. The garden harvest that fall was even more abundant than the previous year, and they spent long days preserving and storing food for the winter. Neighbors came to help, as was the custom, and the women cooed over baby Thomas while the men worked alongside Nathaniel. The community that had once viewed Mary Catherine with suspicion and Nathaniel as an outsider had slowly accepted them, won over by their obvious devotion to each other and their hard work improving the homestead. As winter closed in again, the family of three settled into the warm cabin. On quiet evenings, Nathaniel would hold his son while Mary Catherine read poetry aloud, and he would marvel at how completely his life had changed. The solitary mountain man who had fled from pain and connection had become a husband and father, rooted to this land and these people in ways he had never imagined possible. One night, as they sat together watching their son sleep in the cradle Nathaniel had built, Mary Catherine turned to her husband with a thoughtful expression. "Do you ever think about that day?" she asked. "The day you found me crying in the garden?" "I think about it often." Nathaniel pulled her closer against his side. "Sometimes I wonder what would have happened if I had ridden past, if I had not stopped to help." "I would have managed somehow," Mary Catherine said. "But I would have been alone and struggling. I would have survived, but I would not have lived. You gave me back my life, Nathaniel." "No," he said, kissing the top of her head. "We gave each other our lives back. You showed me that it was possible to love again, to trust again, to build something good from grief and loss. Before I met you, I was just a man hiding in the mountains, running from his pain. You made me remember who I was meant to be." Mary Catherine tilted her face up to kiss him, a sweet, lingering kiss full of love and promise. "Then I suppose we are both fortunate that I am such a terrible farmer that I could not keep wild horses out of my garden." Nathaniel laughed, the sound rich and warm in the quiet cabin. "Best crop failure that ever happened." The years that followed were full and good. They expanded the homestead steadily, adding cattle and more acreage, building the larger cabin Nathaniel had dreamed of. The garden continued to flourish, becoming something of a local legend. People would comment on how nothing Mary Catherine Crane planted ever failed, how her vegetables were always the largest and most abundant at the market, how her land seemed blessed. But Mary Catherine knew the truth. It was not luck or blessing, though she was grateful for both. It was the result of love and hard work, of two people who had found each other in the midst of loss and had chosen to build something beautiful together. Every tomato plant that produced abundantly, every cornstalk that grew tall and strong, every bean vine that climbed its pole was a testament to the day Nathaniel Crane had stopped to help a heartbroken widow replant her ruined garden. They had 3 more children over the years, 2 daughters and another son, and the cabin rang with laughter and life. Nathaniel proved to be as devoted a father to each child as he had been to Thomas, patient and loving, teaching them to ride and hunt and care for the land. Mary Catherine taught them reading and poetry and the art of coaxing life from stubborn Montana soil. As the children grew, Thomas showed signs of inheriting his father's size and strength, shooting up tall and broad-shouldered, with Nathaniel's blue eyes and easy way with animals. The daughters, Margaret and Sarah, had their mother's auburn hair and quick wit, while young William was quiet and thoughtful, often found with his nose in a book. On warm summer evenings, the family would gather on the porch of their expanded cabin, and Nathaniel and Mary Catherine would sit close together, watching their children play in the yard. Sometimes Mary Catherine would think back to that terrible morning when she had knelt in the destroyed garden and wept, certain that all hope was lost. The memory seemed to belong to another person, another life, so far removed from the happiness she had found. "What are you thinking about?" Nathaniel would ask, and she would smile up at him. "Just counting my blessings," she would reply, and he would pull her closer, understanding without need for further words. Thomas grew to be 18, tall and strong like his father, with a gentle nature that made him beloved in the community. He had no memory of the Thomas O'Brien for whom he was named, but Mary Catherine had told him stories over the years, making sure he understood the legacy of courage and dreams he carried. On the anniversary of Thomas O'Brien's death each year, the family would visit his grave on the hillside, and Mary Catherine would place wildflowers there, honoring the man who had brought her west and given her the foundation on which she had built this new life. There was no jealousy in Nathaniel about these remembrances. He understood that love was not a finite resource, that Mary Catherine's honoring of her first husband did not diminish her love for her second. If anything, it made him love her more, seeing how faithfully she held to her memories while still living fully in the present. The years brought challenges as well as joys. There were droughts and early frosts, illness and accidents, all the trials that came with homesteading in Montana Territory. But they faced each challenge together, their love and partnership growing stronger with each obstacle overcome. The garden remained the heart of the homestead, expanded and refined over the years into something remarkable, a patchwork of abundance that fed their family and provided surplus to help neighbors in need. Nathaniel never fully lost his connection to the mountains. Once or twice a year, he would take one of the children, usually Thomas, and spend a week in the high country, teaching them the skills that had kept him alive during his solitary years. But he always returned home with relief and joy, grateful for the wilderness, but more grateful for the family waiting for him. As Mary Catherine reached her 40th year, she would sometimes stand at the edge of the garden in the early morning, watching the sun rise over the mountains and feeling the weight of her blessings. 4 healthy children, a husband who loved her with steadfast devotion, a homestead that had grown from a struggling claim to a prosperous farm, and this garden, this miraculous garden that had been the catalyst for everything. She thought about the day Nathaniel had promised to replant every single seed and how he had kept that promise with such dedication. But the seeds he had truly planted went far deeper than vegetables. He had planted hope in her heart, had cultivated love from the soil of shared grief, had grown a family from the ruins of loneliness and loss. When Margaret married a young rancher from the next valley over, it was Nathaniel who walked her down the aisle, his eyes suspiciously bright as he gave his daughter's hand to another man. When Sarah announced her intention to become a teacher, it was Mary Catherine who helped her prepare, drawing on her own early dreams and making sure her daughter had the books and education she needed. When young William showed an aptitude for music, they found a way to get him a fiddle, though money was tight, because they believed in nurturing the unique gifts of each child. And Thomas, their firstborn, eventually took over much of the running of the homestead, working alongside his father with the same quiet competence that Nathaniel brought to every task. He courted a girl from Helena, a sensible young woman with a kind smile, and when he brought her home to meet his parents, Mary Catherine saw the same look in his eyes that Nathaniel had worn when he first realized he was falling in love. The wheel of life turned, as it always did, bringing new generations and new stories. But the foundation remained solid, built on that day when a mountain man stopped to help a widow, when 2 broken people found healing in each other and in the simple act of pushing seeds into fertile soil. Years later, when Mary Catherine and Nathaniel were in their 60s, graying but still vital, they stood together in the garden on a warm summer afternoon. Their grandchildren played nearby, Thomas's children and Margaret's shrieking with laughter as they chased each other between the rows of corn. "Do you remember?" Mary Catherine asked, though she knew he did. They had told the story so many times over the years that it had become family legend. "Every detail," Nathaniel replied, his arm around her shoulders. "You were kneeling right about here, crying like your heart was broken." "It was broken. And then you came along and helped me plant it back together." Nathaniel smiled, that same beautiful smile that still made her heart skip after all these years. "Best decision I ever made, stopping to help that day. Best day of my life, when the mustangs destroyed this garden." Mary Catherine leaned into his warmth, watching the children play, watching the vegetables grow, watching the sun paint everything gold. Strange how the worst moments can lead to the best things. "Not strange," Nathaniel said. "Just life. Seeds have to break open before they can grow. Sometimes people do too." They stood in comfortable silence, 2 people who had learned each other's hearts so thoroughly that words were often unnecessary. The garden stretched around them, abundant and thriving, a living testament to the power of persistence and love. Every tomato vine, every cornstalk, every bean pole held the memory of that first desperate replanting, when a grieving widow and a lonely mountain man had worked side by side and discovered that broken things could be made whole again. As the sun began to set, painting the mountains in shades of purple and gold, Nathaniel and Mary Catherine walked slowly back to the house, hand in hand. Behind them, the garden glowed in the golden light, beautiful and abundant, a monument to the day despair had turned to hope and loneliness had bloomed into love. The heartbroken widow had wept over her ruined crops, and the mountain man had replanted every single seed. But in doing so, He had planted something far more precious, a future filled with love, family, and the deep satisfaction of a life well lived together. Their story became part of the land itself, told and retold by their children and grandchildren, passed down through generations as a reminder that sometimes the greatest blessings grow from the deepest losses, and that love, like a well-tended garden, can flourish in even the most unlikely soil. And if you stood in that garden on a quiet evening, listening carefully, you might almost hear the echo of two voices, laughing together in the twilight, still planting seeds of hope and harvesting joy, season after season, year after year, forever.